Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament Gospels, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we're looking at Jesus healing two blind beggars. This comes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we're going to focus on Matthew 20, 29 through 34 today for today's reading. And it says here, so if we start this out, it says, as Jesus and the disciples left the town of Jericho, a large crowd followed behind him. The two blind men were sitting beside the road. When they heard that Jesus was coming that way, they began to shout, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Be quiet, the crowd yelled at them. But sorry about that. But they only shouted louder. So the crowd's telling them to be quiet, and here they are just shouting louder. And they, Lord, Son of David. That's important to understand that they kept calling him Son of David. Have mercy on us. When Jesus heard him, he stopped and called, What do you want me to do for you? So it's like, obviously, like we're blind. He said, Lord, they said, we want to see. Jesus felt sorry for them and touched their eyes. Instantly, they could see. Then they followed him. And this was not uncommon. Jesus would do this a lot. As we see, like there was a couple times instances where we saw where Jesus asked them what they wanted, because for some of these people, especially those who were blind, some of that, this was their way of living. And so by healing them, then they would lose a certain income and have to find something else to do. So there was actually, him asking them, "What do you want me to do?" Wasn't him being sarcastic or not knowing. It was, "What do you want? What do you?" And in these cases, we see they wanted him to heal him. And so this is going to be a shorter lesson and just a shorter section of verse. But, the one thing to notice in here, again, this comes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew records that there were two blind men, while Mark and Luke mentioned only one. And more than likely, this is the same event. And so different writers had different writing styles. And sometimes we see this with when Jesus pushed the demons into the pigs, right? Sometimes they would say, well, there was two people there, and others wrote about the one. And so more than likely what Mark and Luke did was they singled out the more vocal of the two men, the one who would probably the one talking the most, whereas Matthew talked about both of them. Again, doesn't take away from anything. It's just, to me, this adds to the legitimacy of the Gospels, because we see that you have three different writers, and you have like anyone who writes anything, you have three different perspectives, three different points of views, three different people writing, and so you're going to see those different perspectives as they write in. To me, if we read all the Gospels and every single one of them were exactly the same down to every detail, then to me that would show that they actually weren't legitimate and they were copies of each other. And so here we see the different perspectives from each one's telling their story. And so they're on their way, right? He was leaving the town of Jericho, and so although Jesus was concerned about the coming events in Jerusalem, right? He was coming to Jerusalem, the things that were going to happen there. Those were on his mind. We know that. He still demonstrated what he'd been teaching his disciples about service, right? We just looked at this last week in or yesterday, I'm sorry, with Matthew 20, verse 28, by stopping to care for the blind man. He was showing them that, even though he had all these things going on, he still stopped to take care of these people. And it was not an uncommon thing to see beggars that in towns like this, in most towns, because unlike what we have today, right? We have safety nets. We have a lot of different things that people can take advantage of. And even in today, we still have people who beg and homeless and those type of situations. So it probably had a little bit more back then, but again, it wasn't an uncommon thing to see. And so, just like we see it and can become used to it, then that it would be common for them. And the reason was this: for most occupations of that day, they required physical labor. And so anyone who had a crippling disease or disability was at a severe disadvantage. And they were usually forced to beg. And so and this is the one thing here, right? Even though God's laws commanded them to care for the needy, you can find this in Leviticus 25, the law was that they should care for the needy. The Pharisees, especially, and the religious leaders, they had ignored a lot of these laws and focused on the wrong ones. And we got to be careful that we don't do that. And the other thing too is blindness was considered a curse from God for sin, but Jesus refuted that idea, right? When he reached out and healed the blind. They weren't being punished for their sinfulness. We know that people were born with disabilities. Sometimes people go blind. There's a lot of different things. Sin in the world caused a lot of problems, caused a lot of diseases, caused a lot of those things. And so that's the result of sin. Not, oh, that guy's blind because he's a horribly sinful person. No, it's sometimes it's cause and effect, and other times it's just that's the way they were born. And so, we need to make sure we don't get into that type of mentality of, oh well, they have a disability or something's wrong with them, so they must have done something wrong. No, that's not how that works. And so we need to be careful with that. The one thing we do see here is that the blind men called Jesus the Son of David, and that was a title for the Messiah. You can find that in Isaiah 11 verses 1 through 3. And so these blind men understood that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. They could see it. They were blind, but they understood it, and they could see who he was. And it's an interesting note, right? It's an interesting note that these poor blind beggars, right? They could see that Jesus was the Messiah, while the religious leaders who saw all of his miracles were blinded to his identity and refused to recognize him as the Messiah. I love that point of thinking about that, is these blind guys who could not see, right, understood that Jesus was the Messiah, and the Pharisees who were looking for the Messiah missed him completely because they refused to humble themselves and lower themselves a little bit and admit that they could be wrong about who this man was. So it's an interesting perspective. And so that's kind of the notes we have on that. The main point I would pull out of this is that, Jesus stopped to help these people, even though he was on his way to complete a very important mission. And so we need to make sure that we, as Christians, don't get lost in our mission and ignore those, like trying to fulfill our mission and ignore those who need our help. We definitely need to do that. And we also need to make sure that we don't become blind to the fact of who Jesus is in that mission, right? Like the Pharisees did here, that they got so focused on being perfect, right? Being self-righteous, that they completely forgot who they were supposed to be there for. But these blind people taking care of the poor and doing that thing, and they got lost in that and they couldn't even recognize Jesus. So don't become so religious that you become blind to who Jesus is. That's a very important message, I believe. As always, I appreciate everyone for tuning in and watching. Again, this was a little bit shorter one, but I still appreciate everyone for following along, reading along with us on the daily reading. I hope it's been beneficial. If it is, share it, help other people out. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do that. We're going to continue to put out different content and go down into different studies. And as always, I appreciate everyone for watching.